I'm John Sarno with Borrego Solar, project manager for this project. The first thing to notice here is our placard here says electrical service also served by a photovoltaic power source. What that's saying is that most units are going to have, if you don't have a breaker up here, you've got a breaker outside, which is your main power from the line after the meter, servicing this particular unit. What this placard is alerting us to is the fact that in addition to the input of power from the grid, we also have input of power from a photovoltaic power source. Meaning that if we're going to do any work on this particular unit, we're going to want to disengage the power source from the photovoltaic system such that we don't get injured or cause injury to anybody else. The other thing to notice by that is that it means that there are two sources of power, which means that power has multiple directions to go in. So that means that if power is coming in from a photovoltaic source, it can also go out to the grid. So this is the breaker labeled down here as solar panel DC inverter. It's a 2-pole 15 amp breaker. In order for the system to be operational, we need to engage that breaker into the on position, and that will allow current from the solar system to now feed this panel. So basically it looks like a breaker, but it's a service. So it's the same thing as if you're familiar with having a 100 amp or 125 amp switch at the top of your panel. That will be just a feed. This is the same thing, it's a feed. One other thing to notice about this is that electricity will never flow backwards through this breaker. It's never going to go back to the panel, so to speak. Okay, so this should always be in the on position. If anyone's ever going to do any work on the house, anything to any wiring in the house, it's super important to just turn this breaker off before we do anything else. Okay, and that's what that's for. In terms of maintenance on these, they're pretty good at staying clean. The only concern we have is if there is extensive pollen in the spring, early springtime, you might end up seeing a film accumulate. If that does happen, the only maintenance we ever suggest is just spraying them with a water hose. So as far as snow shedding, you can see that they're pretty clear right now, whereas the other roofs around here are pretty full of snow. That has to do with the fact, obviously, we're facing south, so they get the most solar radiation, but also that the modules will heat up as they're producing electricity to create a lubricating layer under the snow, melting some of the underneath ice, and then the whole thing will just slide right off, which can be a risk, as we've noticed here with the avalanches falling off the roof. The good part of that is that we're not going to lose significant production due to snow. We got a pretty good storm here Wednesday, and these things are cranking away. So we can do things like snow guards and snow bars, snow rails to try and slow that movement, but these panels do want to shed the snow, and they do want to continue to make electricity. Also to note is that they will make electricity through the snow up to a couple inches. Snow is translucent, and therefore the wavelengths that we are interested in for making electricity are still available to make electrons flow. And when that happens, there is some resistance heat loss that escapes from the module's surface, which then adds into the process of shedding the snow. So if the systems are turned off, they'll actually have snow on them for longer than if they're turned on. So keeping the systems on is a great way to keep them actually working as well. There's nothing else you should ever have to do for module maintenance. Everything is plug and play. We leave it on. We don't touch any wires up there. We don't send anybody up there with any rakes or anything like that. We don't ever touch the surface with anything hard. If we need to use something to clean them, we use those snow broom foam, kind of foam squeegee things that you use to clean cars off with. And that's pretty much the only thing we'd ever recommend. You never want to use a broom on them. You never want to use anything that could scar or scratch the surface. So now I think we can go over and look at the electrical equipment. The only danger is that in addition to the power coming from the grid, there's also power coming from here. But there are a few safety mechanisms in place. The first one is that if there's no power from the grid, this is no longer live. The power stops at the inverter outside, and I'll show you that. So that means that when the grid goes down, if there's no power, then we don't have power either. It also means if you flip that switch at the meter, then this is no longer a safety issue. So there's actually no additional safety risk to the homeowner for having this in here, and there's no additional risk for wiring this thing unless you could somehow isolate this circuit, which I don't see anybody doing. I mean, you have to turn off the breaker outside before you rewire anything here anyways, The only danger if somebody is wiring stuff hot in here and they fail to recognize that there's a breaker outside, then you have the danger of the current from the grid and the current from the solar. So maybe they're only worried about touching these conductors, but also the conductors coming into this breaker are hot, not just the ones going out. So that's the only danger.
So in other words, this is only live if your main circuit is on. And if you shut the main circuit off, the whole thing's dead.
Yep, and I'll give you the rationale behind that.
Well, yeah.
Think about a computer, something that requires a consistent current to run. Well, what if you didn't have, right now the grid acts kind of like as a buffer, so whatever we're making for power, you think about the current that's coming out of the inverter, it might change, We have to match the voltage of the grid, right? And the frequency of the grid, but the current might change, and so the kilowatt output changes. The voltage is constant, the current fluctuates. Well, your computer needs a current that's stable to operate properly, right? If it doesn't have that, peaks and drops can really seriously damage your computer, your circuit boards and stuff, right? So what that means is the grid needs to supply a current that is pretty much stable. Now, if the solar is not using the grid as a battery to stabilize the current when clouds go by and when the temperature changes, then you're going to have power coming out of your wall that's fluctuant based upon clouds. And so you'll be working on your computer, and then a cloud would go by, and the computer would, give some alert and break. And that is the reason that doesn't happen is because we are synchronizing with the grid, and we are using the grid as a battery to store excess from, to take from. We don't need it, and it's called a grid interactive system for that reason. The only way this could ever be dangerous is if you installed a battery backup system to this and a charge controller, which is not happening. So. And that would mean that you wouldn't need the grid because you'd have that battery that you can keep feeding electricity into, and then the battery charge controller will be able to modify the current and give you what you actually need for power to keep your home appliances and stuff working properly. So, yeah, the only way this could ever even be a serious issue is if you did have a storage system in the house.
Right.